Coming up on Access Tech Live.
Google puts accessibility on the big screen at the big game. Sex and accessibility. Can tech bridge the gap? Safer Internet Day. How Microsoft is helping.
This is Access Tech Live with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo. The latest in tech and accessibility every week. Follow us now and get involved at Access Tech Live.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Access Tech Live. I am Stephen Scott. Marc Aflalo is with me every week. How are you doing this week, Marc?
I can't complain. I'm really excited. It feels like it's been a long time since we've been together, but I think that's just because I've been traveling and not in the studio. So that's my imagination working here.
Yeah, no, it's just been a week. I promise you, 7 days. That's all it's been. It feels like longer, but you know, that is because you're so pleased to see me. I know that. You don't need to say it. I just know. Look, this week we've got to put a big PG on the episode this week because we're going to be talking about a subject that, to be honest, most of us, I think, tend to shy away from. Let's be brutally honest with ourselves. And that is sex. I am certainly someone who doesn't talk about it very often, especially on air. Rochelle Manette is the host of That Sex Show, which you can find on AMI Plus, and she'll be joining us to help navigate this interesting and hopefully enlightening conversation.
Yeah, Stephen, we got an email from our show last week. Remember, I was in studio in Toronto, and we had Jacob Szymanski and Ramya Amithan were on the show, and I put you all to the test with AI voices, and we got an email that I thought would be fitting to throw into the show this week from Camille Savoie, a friend of the show, who writes, I just finished listening to the latest episode of the show. I really enjoyed it. I found out about Jacob and Ramya's weekly podcast just a few months ago, and I'm enjoying that as well. I was wrong about the voices that Marc made us listen to. I was certain that the last two were human. Wow. You see, I'm getting a lot of feedback on that one just from that little AI test. I'm going to have to come up with a new one, I think, for a couple of weeks from now and put some more people to the test.
Listen, I've been getting heat on this on Double Tap all week. People saying, come on, you didn't know that this was AI? You really didn't know? Seriously, I was struggling with some of those voices. And I think some people thought I was making it up, or maybe I knew the answers in advance. I genuinely had no idea. And it was just really interesting to go back and listen back to that episode, just to get a sense of those clips and you know, really listen to them and think, actually, even now I know they're all AI, I'm still wondering. That's how good they are. That's kind of impressive. So yeah, fantastic episode. Go back and check it, of course, on AMI Plus if you missed that episode last week. Marc may think it was several months ago, but it was only last week. So most recent episode on AMI Plus and on YouTube. But for now, let's get to Marc and the headlines.
Now, Access Tech Live headlines.
So Tuesday was Safer Internet Day, and to commemorate it, Microsoft released a survey that found that 21% of Canadian parents underestimate their teenagers' exposure to online risks. Now, that's frightening and not terribly surprising. Microsoft is also releasing a new resource and new resources, including Good Game. That's an edition of Minecraft, which allows you to kind of take things to a gaming adventure that teaches players how to protect themselves and others against negative online behaviors. Very cool from them. Okay, Stephen, the wheelchair's biggest enemy is about to meet its match. Yes, stairs come in all shapes and sizes, and until now, wheelchairs couldn't navigate them no matter the shape of the stairs. Now, a company called the Stair Climbing Company has developed a new device called the Mobile Stair Climbers. They're battery operated and mobile, hence the name, which means a single operator can help a wheelchair user climb a flight of stairs with ease. Facilities are loving it because it doesn't require any permanent installations, and users love it for the ease of use and, of course, the new form of access, which is pretty cool. Researchers from Cambridge University have developed a robotic sensor that uses AI to read Braille faster than most humans. The robot Braille reader was initially developed as a test for the development of robotic hands or prosthetics, but it has since figured out how to slide its hand over lines of Braille, achieving a reading speed of 315 words per minute to an accuracy of 90%. Right now, the technology is pretty big. Researchers are hoping to scale it down so that it could live in parts of a prosthetic hand in the future. This means that people with artificial limbs could gain the senses they need to feel the raised writing down the road. Google is putting accessibility on display during this weekend's big game. Their Pixel 8 and guided frame feature is the subject of their 30-second commercial during this weekend's Super Bowl matchup in Las Vegas. Thanks to the new camera hardware and the latest Pixel devices, the guided frame feature has received some new improvements. The feature by itself is innovative as it helps people who are partially sighted center subjects in the frame when taking pictures. The updates, though, include better accuracy, recognition of pets and food, and it now works on both the front and rear-facing cameras. Hats off to Google for shining the spotlight on this feature during the big game this weekend. Oh, Super Bowl stuff, Stephen. It's always fun to kind of tackle down this weekend.
About the Super Bowl, everyone, I'm talking to you and the team here at AMI, everyone's so excited about Super Bowl. Look, I'm from the UK. I have no idea what this is. We barely know what sport is in this country. Can you explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old? I don't feel like I'm talking to ChatGPT.
This is the culmination of the NFL season, the National Football League season. It's the big finale. Who's going to win the big trophy at the end of the day? But over the years, it's become pretty much popularized for two things. Number one is it's always been the commercials. Number one, the price of commercials, a 30-second commercial, is in the millions, if not tens of millions of dollars by this point. So anybody who does buy a commercial spends tons of money trying to create the funniest or most innovative ad, which is always interesting. It's A, that they're expensive, and B, that they're trying to put it on this big stage. And since '93, I think it was, when Michael Jackson first made his appearance on the halftime show during the Super Bowl, it's been about the big names they can get to perform. Over the years, we've seen the likes of course, Michael Jackson, Rihanna. I mean, think of Justin Timberlake, Janet Jackson. Before that, before '93, if I'm not mistaken, and I've been researching this a bit, it's only been marching bands. They've done like tributes to things like Star Wars and different, phenomena, events that go on in the world, but nothing with big name celebrities. So it's a pretty big deal on this side of the pond, Steve. It's something that maybe you'll watch the commercials afterwards.
Okay, well, if we get access to them, I certainly will. That Google ad sounds very interesting. If you want to, I love the fact that, being able to take a picture of your own face has become so accessible. This is fantastic news. Also, I want to say...
The ad, Stephen, is actually quite phenomenal. If maybe we'll play it next week and I can describe it for you a little bit. It leaves a little bit of description, but to give you the quick rundown, it just shows the perspective of the low vision user with a very blurry image, and you hear guided frame centering him in the actual frame. And as the 30 seconds goes on, first it's one person in frame, then he has a girlfriend, two people in frame, then there's a pet, and it ends, of course, with him and his wife or partner giving birth, and there's three people in frame. So it's a nice emotional piece of real estate, and that's going to shine on Sunday, I think, amongst everything else.
Yeah, and of course, they've released it early on YouTube, so you can go watch it. There's an audio-described version as well on YouTube you can check out. We'll put the link, of course, up on our socials so you can go find it. But, of course, you mentioned the halftime show, and that's something about Super Bowl I do know about, because that's something that does get talked about pretty much worldwide, I guess. And, I think about some of the halftime shows I remember in the past that I've maybe heard about or gone back and watched later on YouTube, and it's kind of led us to our question of the day, Mark.
Yes, it has that, and that is, who or what was your favorite Super Bowl halftime show? You'd think that questions like this are the ones that people are going to go, why should I answer that? But it's gone crazy on social media. So if you want to have your say, no problem. You can connect with us on all our social media platforms. It is at Access Tech Live. If you're watching this on social, hop into the chat. You can do that as well. And of course, our email address is feedback@accesstechlive.com, and you can get involved. Stephen, when we come back, Google's putting that accessibility in the mainstream like never before. We're going to talk about that. Plus, an accessibility point of view on Apple Vision Pro. All that and more after a quick break here on Access Tech Live.
There's more Access Tech Live to come. Get involved and have your say at Access Tech Live on social media. We'll be right back. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. The show will return in less than a minute. Access Tech Live will be back in 30 seconds. Now, back to Access Tech Live, the latest in tech and accessibility with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo.
Welcome back to Access Tech Live, and we're going to dive into some of these headlines we've been talking about. Of course, we're talking there about Google and that advert that they're putting into Super Bowl. You know, it's really interesting, isn't it, Mark? Because when you think about this, you know, a company like Google could talk about anything, and at the moment, everyone's talking about AI and how wonderful AI is, and as they are, but they're kind of doing this with this accessibility twist, and it's incredible to put it in front of so many people because it really does raise the profile of accessibility, something they should be really proud of, I think.
Well, we've seen them do this in mainstream, right? We've seen them put ads on across television, showcase it at keynote events and stuff like that. But I think it's pretty significant that they're using this ad spend at the cost that it is, actual monetary cost, during the big game on Sunday to actually focus on it. You know, kudos to them. You know, hats off to what they're doing because, as you said, they could be talking about absolutely anything. You know, a lot of stuff in the news these days, Stephen, getting attention. The funniest thing is I've had a lot of conversations with people about Apple Vision Pro. You know, this is Apple's, virtual reality headset, even though they don't want anybody calling it a virtual reality headset, not available anywhere outside the US. So we're stuck, you know, peering in on other people's lives and seeing what their first impressions are of Vision Pro. And you actually put out a very cool video with Sean from the Double Tap podcast over there on YouTube, talking about the accessibility, which is something that I think it's still a little bit unknown, right? Until we really get our hands on it or eyes on it, so to speak, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, especially because we haven't heard that many reviews from the disability community as yet. Now, of course, there's reasons for that because of the price point, right? $3,599. I mean, that's a lot of money to shell out on a device.
US
just
dollars,
to review.
by the way. By the time that's
US
in
dollars,
Canada,
yeah.
that's going to be
well,
like $5,000.
It's only available in the US, right? So that's the only place you're going to get it at the moment. And, you know, I think that the problem is for a lot of people, especially disabled people, it's not that attainable at the moment. Now, we will be hearing from people in the coming months, and we'll certainly be hearing from people here on Access Tech Live soon who are going to be testing this out. So that's great. And I really want to get that impression from different people because, you know, this is one of these things. You know, I read a really interesting article this week from a woman called Carrie Ann Lightly. She does this blog, and it was a really interesting article I read, which I've posted on my social, and you should go check it out. It talks about the whole concept of fully accessible. What is fully accessible? What does that actually mean? And, you know, of course, something that's accessible to me might not be accessible to someone else. And that can create a challenge. So, you know, what is this device going to be doing in terms of accessibility? Yeah, I mean, for me, I've got to be honest. We put the video out. We've put it out on YouTube as part of our new Double Tap on YouTube channel, which you can go check out. And it's great because we talk about some of the, you know, almost like what we know so far in terms of the accessibility features without having the chance to try them. But what I'm also kind of finding really interesting at the moment is the amount of people who are talking about these features, getting really excited about them. And I'm just not there at the moment with it. I kind of feel because if I'm being brutally honest, I think I'm just jealous because, you know, here I am.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to use this thing realistically. I mean, look, I can use it. It's accessible to me. It's got lots of features in it I can use, but it's not something I'd necessarily would use because it's a lot of money to spend when I could basically get the blind version, which is a pair of AirPods Pros.
Yeah, and I just, you know, you and I had a conversation off air earlier, which is that at the end of the day, there are going to be products and categories in life that just can't be accessible.
Yeah.
They can try as much as they want, but as long as there's a visual component, someone who can't see just will not be able to use it to the extent that they want people to use it.
Well, what I would say is I agree with that to an extent. I think that that shouldn't mean that companies should shy away from trying to make the product accessible. Again, what is accessibility, right? So someone who's low vision, I think about friends of the show like Shelley Brisbane, who's been on here. She has low vision. She could really benefit from this device. So I don't want to write off the device. I'm talking from my perspective, right? From me as someone whose vision is at a level where it's just not really attainable to me. There are many people who could get a lot out of this. So. And again, this does have, out of the gate, it's the first device I've ever seen that is out of the gate, first generation, that has got so many accessibility features. There's a guy called Brian Tong, who's a YouTuber, did a fantastic walkthrough. He's a mainstream YouTuber, doesn't talk about accessibility that often, but he did do a fantastic walkthrough of this video. On his video, talking about the accessibility features, walking through the menus inside it. Incredible. Go check that out because it gives you a sense of how much is already in there already.
Yeah, and you know what? I think we're at actually a unique advantage. Well, yes, we can't go out and buy it. I mean, listen, you can cross the border and go buy it if you want to. But I think it's kind of interesting to be sitting back and watching this develop and really get a handle on it before it even becomes available to this market. The thing that really shocks me, to be perfectly honest, Stephen, is the naming of this device, adding something and calling it Pro first generation out of the gate. I think that Pro might mean prototype, not necessarily being professional, but we will see. And we've got people coming on over the coming months who will tell us about their experiences. Earlier this week, Stephen, it was Safer Internet Day. I talked about it in the news. So many stories about AI, and with the U.S. elections coming up, with things like Taylor Swift deepfakes in the news. I mean, there are so many things that people have to be careful about when consuming news. But Meta is actually taking a lead here, and they're starting to, funny enough, use AI to actually detect AI-generated images, and will start tagging them with an icon and actually a little subtitle that says that this was generated by AI or may be suspicious. An interesting move, I think. I'm not sure how useful it's going to be at the end of the day because people are getting really clever with how they use AI to generate misinformation. Do you think it's something that you'd pay attention to?
I think this feels like the problem becomes the solution and as a result becomes another problem. And I don't really understand how we've got here. And I worry about this because the problem is we're already in a world where everyone mistrusts everything, no matter what it is. Whether the Earth is round, if you say that these days, you can get in trouble. There's so many things you can say that just people don't agree with, and they really are against it. They find arguments against it. There's lots of this going on, and the internet and all these deep fakes, for example, are causing problems. Look at this upcoming U.S. election, a perfect example. Already there are robocalls being done by Joe Biden that he's not doing. And, this is going on right now. So we've got to be very careful with this. We've got to start being very careful about identity, our own identities, how that's being used, because this, of course, I think, although it's going to definitely have an impact on elections, I worry more about how this will affect people in their own lives, where someone tries to take our voice. I mean, you and I, for example, maybe someone takes our voice. I'm not suggesting you do it, please don't, but, take our voice and do something with it, try and call someone who we know. I don't know. It could really be, personally, I think it's more scary for people like us than it is for the US elections. I think we'll get over it. I think we'll get by it. I think we have enough problems to worry about than deepfakes. But it is definitely a concern. Whether AI is the solution to that, I don't know, because we always have to remember the main thing here, that it's people, it's humans that are putting in the data. Not the robots creating it themselves, that they don't have, their hands aren't clean. So
someone's still planning this, right? So someone still at the end of the day is a human being planning it. Yeah. We're going to talk about it a bit more next week. We're going to dive into it a bit deeper and try to get some expert opinion on it, and maybe talk about some tips on what we can do as a human race to try and at least protect ourselves. But we'll figure that out next week on the show. But Stephen, when we come back from a quick break, she's the host of That Sex Show on AMI TV and AMI Plus. Rochelle Minette joins us to break down sex and disability with a sprinkle of tech on top of that. We'll be right back.
There's more Access Tech Live to come. Get involved and have your say at Access Tech Live on social media. We'll be right back. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. The show will return in less than a minute. Access Tech Live will be back in 30 seconds. Now, back to Access Tech Live, the latest in tech and accessibility with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo.
And we're back on Access Tech Live. I'm Stephen Scott. Marc Aflalo is with me this week as always. Now look, we love our tech, and this week we're going to push the limits a little bit and add a G rating to this particular show, Marc.
Well, actually, we're going to be adding a PG rating, I think, to this show. Rochelle Minette is a sex educator, a certified therapeutic recreation specialist. She's the education coordinator at Venus Envy Halifax, an education-based sex shop and bookstore where she leads and creates workshops, lectures, other programming, all about sex and sexuality. Now, you may have seen her on AMI TV as the host of that sex show. You can find episodes on AMI+. Rochelle, thank you so much for joining us on Access Tech Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, Rochelle, it's great to have you here. And we're glad to have you here because, look, Marc and I know how important this topic is, but, you know, we're not very accustomed to talking about sex in public, never mind even on television. You do both. So perhaps you could tell us how you get into this profession and why you feel it is so important to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I love talking about sex. There's something about getting to talk about things that I know makes people squeamish. I know people are sort of uncomfy with, and bridging that gap a little bit to get people to be more comfy. I feel like that's so important and kind of like what drives me, I suppose. But yeah, I got into this work sort of by accident. I think that often happens in this kind of work. My background's in recreation therapy, which, you know, focused a lot on disability and leisure and, you know, people's fun and what people wanted to do for fun. And I noticed while I was going through that schooling that there wasn't really people talking about sex or sexuality or like this thing that I know is fun, and I think a lot of people know is fun, and perhaps leisure for a lot of folks. But it just wasn't really coming up, and so I decided to go back to school, do a master's degree, do some research, and focus specifically on sex and disability. And then sort of like during that time, I actually became disabled myself, and you know, it was not news to me per se, but that's when my body sort of changed and got a little more complicated. So it was a very meta experience, I suppose, when I was doing my research. But yeah, that's kind of how I fell into this. I was just like, I feel like people should talk about this more, and they're not. And I'm just going to fill that gap myself, I guess, at least in sort of the world that I was already in. And then I started working at a education-based sex shop and bookstore, and the rest is history.
Rochelle, why don't you think people are talking about it? Why is it so taboo?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think part of it is like that we try to withhold pleasure from people in general. Like it's easier to, get people to fall in line, I think, when, and, in sort of our society where there are a lot of rules that we're supposed to be following. It's easier to get people to follow those rules when we withhold something that feels good, that like is pleasurable. I also think that a lot of our society comes from very puritanical worldviews of what sex is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to be for. And usually that reason is not pleasure-based. It's usually very specific, often around procreation, which, that's definitely not why I am having sex. But, also a valid reason. But I think for the majority of people, it's because it feels good. But yeah, I think it's hard to convince ourselves that we're allowed to feel good. I think there's a lot of hesitancy for some reason for people to do that. And it's like we've been told it's private, we've been told it is taboo, and that just kind of feeds into the idea that it is taboo. It just continues on and on to convince us that we're not supposed to talk about it. But once we start, I don't know, we start realizing a lot of us have a lot of stuff in common, and we're feeling the same things a lot of the time, and the same fears and worried about a lot of the same stigmas. And if we just talked about it, the stigma would probably not exist.
Well, sex, it can be a taboo subject in the mainstream, absolutely. But would you say that when it comes to disability, that perhaps it is even more taboo? That I might even go so far to say, as it has been, I've been accused of being asexual over my years. It's a case of, well, it's almost a case of disabled people don't even think about sex, never mind talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like it stems from so many places of, people assume that people with disabilities are like childlike, or that, we have to be taken care of. And so we're more like children than someone else who doesn't have a disability. And of course, we assume that children don't have sexualities, like even then. And of course, we don't want like kids to be going off and having sex, of course, it's risky and not what's supposed to be happening, I suppose. But by like assigning this sort of like childishness or like this sort of like infantilization to all people with disabilities, we start to think, oh, well, they also shouldn't be having disabilities. If you need someone to take care of you in any way, then that equals like, oh, you shouldn't have sex. But that just doesn't make any sense in my mind. Like we all need to be cared for and care for each other. It just, to different extents and different levels. But, I really don't like, I think this like idea of interdependence can kind of be better for us than this idea of independence, which, often is sort of looked at as like individualism. But yeah, so like that infantilization piece is so huge. I also find that a lot of the conversation, because we're so stuck on that idea of like procreation is the only reason to have sex, and we're also, there's a lot of taboo around disabled people having children, or, people not being able to have children for a variety of reasons, and then being like, well, if you can't have children, then there's no point in sex, even though there's lots of different points of sex. Yeah, and I think like that's such a, that all kind of wrapped up also in the fact that like we never think about asexuality as like a valid sexuality in these conversations. And so for me, who's part of the queer community and who talks a lot about like sexuality and asexuality and just all these different sexualities that exist all at the same time in lots of cool ways, I think. This idea that we've now assigned a specific sexuality to like all disabled people really, I think, confuses a lot of people around like what that even means. And really what I'm finding in sort of the disability world is that it's not that people are asexual necessarily, although there are lots of disabled people who are also ace or aro. But we're being desexualized. And I like that word because it's sort of that verb that's being done to us, and that we don't have to accept that. Like we could just say, actually, I want to have sex. I'm a sexual being. I have sexual attraction to people. And really it's someone else that's people. Like trying to... Yeah,
what you're saying will absolutely surprise people. So look, this is Access Tech Live, right? So we have to talk about tech, otherwise someone shouts in my ear and says, why are you not talking about tech? So I want to ask you this. How does tech itself come into this conversation?
Yeah, so I work at a sex store. And, when I think about sex tech, or when I think about sort of like assistive tech in general, for me, there's this really obvious connection between sex toys, sort of more broadly, and like accessible technology and adaptive technology. And some of it is like pretty low tech. Like I'm going to show you some in a second that are like things attached to other things is really like my favorite thing to do at work. But yeah, for me, there's always been this really obvious connection as someone who like works in this field that sex toys are a form of accessible technology. They help people experience pleasure with more ease. They help people get to where they want to go in some way. And they help people feel the things they want to feel, and that feels really exciting. They literally make pleasure more accessible, and that can be for any person, whether they are disabled or not. And so, yeah, I don't know. One of the things that I really get excited about at work is to figure out how to make sex more accessible with the toys that we have, but also how to make the toys we have more accessible by doing a little bit of sex toy hacking, or what I like to call at least.
And it's about connection too, right? It's about, think about long distance relationship, things about, just people just staying connected no matter where they are. Rochelle, stick around for a minute. I want to get to those toys, and we want to talk about this a little bit further. We're going to take a quick break and come back so you're not interrupted as you go through it. So stick around. This is Access Tech Live. Rochelle Minette will be back with us in just a moment here.
There's more Access Tech Live to come. Get involved and have your say at Access Tech Live on social media. We'll be right back. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. The show will return in less than a minute. Access Tech Live will be back in 30 seconds. Back to Access Tech Live, the latest in tech and accessibility with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo.
And we're back on Access Tech Live. Rochelle Minette is with us this week as we break down some of the stigma around sex and disability. Now, Rochelle is the host of That Sex Show. Let's watch a clip.
My name is Andrew Jansen. I use they and he pronouns. And I am a person with a disability. I have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it affects me in a number of different ways, but I use a power wheelchair, and I have support workers that help me with things.
So let's start with talking a little bit about Tetra Society. What do they do, and how did they get involved with sex toys?
Yeah, the Tetra Society is a national organization that builds custom assistive devices for people with disabilities. So if you can't find it commercially, that's where we come into play. So we got into the area of sex toys because the same reason we get into any other area of devices is that people requested it. We said, why not? And so let's try this and make it happen for people. You don't need to have a disability per se or identify as having one to have difficulty using a lot of the toys that are out there. It's amazing when you think about them, and they're just really hard to hold. A lot of them.
Yeah, totally.
It's just like, how am I supposed to grasp this thing to use it in the first place for most people? And then imagine having any kind of additional barrier, whether that's dealing with pain or function in your hands or being able to see and interact with something in the same way. Thinking about how do we build adaptive handles for things, or how do we change the shape or the material of something so that you get a different sensation out of it, and it's not so like the vibration isn't so intense and rough. Like, sometimes those things are just too much.
Yeah.
That's Andrew Yanston there on That Sex Show with Rochelle Manette, who's with us this week on Access Tech Live. You can watch episodes of that show on AMI Plus. Now, Rochelle is with us here, and we're going to get into this conversation around the tech itself. But you said something before the break that I thought was really interesting. You said it was another form of assistive technology. And I guess that comes with all the same accessibility challenges that we face with our apps and our websites and like we're just hearing from Andrew there, the physical nature of products.
Absolutely. Yeah, I find that like we've come pretty far in the sex toy industry of making products that meet more needs and fit more bodies. But I find that the idea that someone might have a hard time like gripping an object is always sort of like lost in the fray of things, or how like that something might be too heavy for most people to hold, let alone someone who has like decreased mobility in their hands or shoulders or arms. I still think that because of all the stigma that exists around sex and disability, there's still not a ton of mainstream sex toy companies that are creating really thoughtful toys from that lens, at least, of like, how do we make this more accessible for lots of different people and not just sort of who we think our market is going to be.
Rochelle, I know you're going to show us some stuff that you have there, but before you do that, I wanted to ask about, in that clip that we played from That Sex Show, Andrew talks about the fact that, people ask, so they deliver. That's something that they do, the Tetris Society. Do you think it's a case of people not reaching out to some of these manufacturers and saying, hey, by the way, we're here. Can you make this work a little bit different for us?
I think, yeah, like a little bit. I sometimes wonder how, like, if you're not already sort of in the sex toy industry, how involved are you in the sex toy industry? It's but I do find that there is a little bit more conversation happening. Like when I was doing some prep for this and talking to one of my friends who is in sex research, we were talking about like, well, what are the big names in the sex toy industry even saying when it comes to accessibility? And so we went on to this specific website that has like all the news that you could possibly find when it comes to, kind of what's like going on in the sex toy industry and in the sex industry in general. And there was like one article from 2023. And then before that, there was like an article from maybe 10 years ago. And the 10 years ago one wasn't like, when they talk about accessibility, it's very basic. It's very like, well, we're talking physical accessibility most of the time. We're not thinking about how someone will afford that physically accessible thing in theory, or, what goes into setting it up to make it accessible for someone. But really, like a lot of people who don't experience disability themselves, I think are very stuck on like the physical piece of like, how do I carry this? How do I hold this? What do I do if I don't walk, or if I need someone to set something up physically for me? And there's a lot missed in terms of like sensory stuff. Often is a big one that I find is getting missed a lot. And yeah, same with like vision loss or really anything beyond like, oh, this person uses a wheelchair, so we have to make sure that like this works for that. There's just, without consulting with disabled people, they're going to miss stuff.
Yeah.
So let's do some show and tell. What do you got there? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I love show and tell. This is my favorite bit. So I'm like, got to start with this big thing that I've got here first, of course, because it is pretty honking. It's heavy. This is called the Kion, is what the toy is called, by the brand Kiro. And Kiro makes some pretty like high tech type devices, and lots of mostly stroker sleeves. And stroker sleeves are essentially made for someone who has a penis, or something that sort of like is external from the body. And really what they normally are is some kind of squishy sleeve with an opening at the front that you put some lube in, and it feels good when you move it around. Usually there's a lot of, things you have to do with your hands. You either have to move it up and down that way, or you need to move your hips. And so in this case, Kiro has made a device that kind of does all the work for you. And I'm not, I had to change out what was on the front because it was like maybe not super PG. So this is just on the front
Appreciate
here.
that.
Yeah, right. It's like
I thought that honestly, I thought there was a microphone on your table before.
Yeah.
I didn't. I mean, can you describe it to the audience who can't see it, obviously?
Yeah, totally. So what I have attached to my table, and it sort of has one of those like, can't remember what they're called, but like a clasp that makes it stay on a surface. Clamp. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. And attached to it is this big honking machine that is black. It's kind of got some fancy buttons on it. It looks very sleek. And there's kind of like a hole protruding out of it. And in that hole is the squishy stroker sleeve. And this one is clear and doesn't have any specific kind of defining features on it. I would say it's just kind of got some texture to it. But you can also get them that have like a body part where the opening is, so that you can do a little imagination, I suppose. For if you like a visual of that. I took that off for this because when I showed my partner, they were like, "Are you going to put that on TV?" I was like, "Oh, right. I have to just think about where I'm going." And I often forget because I'm just kind of in this world and forget what.
I just want to ask you, Rochelle, on the point about what you were talking about there, with the fact that this can almost assist you itself, because I imagine a lot of these devices have buttons on them, which again can create problems, or apps that are connected to them, or whatever it might be. So how does this one differ to that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, it is really useful for the physical pieces, but I would say is missing a lot when it comes to the accessibility of like the buttons. I had to play around for like 10 minutes to figure out what buttons to even press to make it work. And they're all in like kind of hidden places. And so what is cool about this is it does the work for you, but someone has to press those buttons and someone has to find those buttons. And so, even what I would consider like kind of up there in accessible technology is still pretty inaccessible. And it's so heavy. It's a really heavy toy. I was like kind of trying to play around with it before, and it was hard to carry. I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. It's also gigantic, and so going to be more difficult to store. And yeah, it's just we've only really gone so far in something that we're considering accessible technology in this case.
So this is considered accessible because it's clamped and it doesn't move, I guess. So you don't have to physically, manhandle it,
Exactly. And it kind of does the work for you. Like, I'll turn it on if I can, again, also figure out where the button is.
Find the buttons, yeah.
Let's see. Yeah. So you can sort of, it's like going in and out. That part that you would like put a body part in is moving on its own. And I don't know how obvious that is on the camera.
You say it's big, but I'm kind of thinking to myself, there's a privacy aspect to this, because a lot of people may have someone, like, for example, okay, if it's a carer, maybe someone who they know, then that's okay. They'll probably understand, and that's fine. But, if you have friends around, you don't want someone finding it and sort of bringing it out saying, what on earth is this, right? There's a privacy aspect to this, I guess, as well.
Yeah, for sure. And a conversation I have with a lot of folks is they're not necessarily comfortable having their carers like come and like set up their masturbation time, or like come and help them set up for like sex with another person. It's there is a lot of like vulnerability that we sort of have to be okay with when we're setting up to use something like this, or really just
this is the thing, isn't it? We always have to we always have to give so much of ourselves to other people, don't we, as when we're disabled? We have to open ourselves up to other people in ways that a lot of people who are not disabled don't even think about. You know, they drive to work on their own, singing along in the car. You know, for me, that's sitting in a taxi or a bus. You know, I'm always having to sit with someone. You know, you're never really alone, and that can, with this particular topic, that can be really difficult, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a conversation that I have with a lot of people. And even like when they're dating, when they're trying to find like new sexual partners, there's a lot of, you know, you have to tell them a lot more than someone who's able-bodied might share with someone their first time having sex.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes you can frame it as like, this is my access need, but sometimes it's like, okay, you're going to learn my whole life story, because if I don't share it with you, you might ask the questions anyways. And like, then what do I do? It's kind of like, I might as well get that out right off the bat to try to stave off uncomfortable conversations in a sense.
So that's one example of accessible product. What else do you got?
Yeah, so this is the toy that, you know, says it's accessible and we want it to be accessible, and it's okay. My favorite kinds of accessible toys are ones that I have kind of, I don't know, MacGyvered or like hacked on my own to make them more accessible. So here I've got a pillow. Pillows for me are kind of one of my favorite accessible devices in a sense. Like, they're very low tech. I think a lot of us probably have a pillow somewhere. But here I've attached a thigh harness to it. And so a thigh harness, it kind of looks like a knee brace from, you know, if you're used to using a knee brace. But what it is essentially like a stretchy band. And it has Velcro on one end, so you can attach it to things. And then in sort of the middle of that band, there's a little hole, and it's got some like what would be an address, like boning essentially, to try to give it some structure. And it's a great accessibility tool anyways, because if you're someone who is seated most of the time, or, you know, there's just a lot of reasons that like your pelvis can't be involved in some kind of sexual experience, you can just attach it to your thigh, or in this case, a pillow. And I love playing around with this because just attaching a harness to a pillow, like I can do so much with this. And this is one of my favorite things. So for one, like, of course, you can sort of put a dildo in it into the way that it's meant to be used. Here I have what is actually a thrusting vibrator. Also had to think about which one to bring so that it wouldn't be too, you know, freaky, I guess. And it kind of like, it's doing the job for you. It's thrusting, it's going up and down. It just looks like any standard sort of dildo or vibrator, or however you want to call it. And it's got a base that you can fit into that harness here. And so you can hold the pillow to you, or someone else can hold the pillow to you. And it means you don't have to use your hands and all that dexterity. I also find that the buttons here have a little bit more texture where you can kind of tell what they are. And there's only 3 buttons, so not a ton of work to memorize kind of where they are and feel it out and see what you can do with that.
I love the MacGyvering aspect of it, because you're just making something that wasn't accessible in the first place. Can I ask you a question about some of the app controlled devices that some are even internet connected? We had a conversation with a company at CES that was talking about some of those devices, and they didn't really know what I was talking about when it came to the accessibility of the control mechanism itself, being the app itself. Are we finding more and more of these type of devices show up in mainstream?
Yeah, so like right now I can think of several different brands that are doing like app controlled technology. But when I've like written to them to be like, how accessible is your technology? Like, can someone who uses a screen reader use it? Or like, can someone who uses like voice to text use it? Like, is there some kind of voice control mechanism to it? And usually if there is a voice control mechanism, it still has to be accessed somehow, like by our fingers and by the way that we would use, and like by our eyes ultimately. And I don't think that that's being thought of so much when it comes to disability. Like, they're definitely thinking about access to pleasure from like I guess an able-bodied perspective, from like well, we want people to be able to access this when they're far away from each other, or like kind of secretly, like you just look like you're on your phone, but actually you're controlling someone's toy from wherever, while you're like at the grocery store or something. I don't know what people are doing. You know, we're all a little weird when we want to be. But yeah, like I do find that even in these in these like pieces of tech that are supposed to be really high tech and like kind of the first of their kind, they're still missing the ball when it comes to making more accessible technology or making technology more accessible.
Rochelle, I just want to take a moment just to say thank you so much for coming on, because this is a really interesting topic, but it's, I imagine for so many people, including me, although I have to say I'm kind of coming around to the idea of talking about it. I think it's fascinating. I'm really glad we did. I want to recognize you, but I also want to recognize here at AMI, people actually willing to have this conversation, because this is real world, right? This is the world we live in. And, you know, we're disabled people, but that doesn't mean sex is off limits, and it shouldn't be. So I'm really grateful to you for coming on and sharing your insights and just in the way you've done it so respectfully as well. Thank you for that, Rochelle.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is my favorite thing to talk about. I love talking about sex, but I really love talking about accessibility in sex. It's just, you know, my two favorite things wrapped into one.
Rochelle, if people want to get a hold of you or track you down, where can they find you?
Yeah, so best way to get a hold of me is through Venus Envy. So venusenvy.ca is our website. And if you're an Instagram person, it's at Venus Envy HFX for the Halifax location and at Venus Envy Ottawa for the Ottawa location. And I'm in Halifax, so that's the best way to get a hold of me. But either is fine. I work for both, so anyone can find me in those ways.
Rochelle Monette, thank you so much for taking the time to join us again. If people want to find that sex show, you can check out AMI Plus right now. When we come back, answers to our question of the day. What was your favorite halftime show? It's coming up in just a couple of days. This is Access Tech Live. We'll be back in just a moment.
There's more Access Tech Live to come. Get involved and have your say at Access Tech Live on social media. We'll be right back. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. Access Tech Live will return in less than 2 minutes. Access Tech Live is in a commercial break. The show will return in less than a minute. Access Tech Live will be back in 30 seconds. To Access Tech Live, the latest in tech and accessibility with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo.
And we're back on Access Tech Live, and just time to tell you that you can get in touch at any time with this show and tell us what you think about the program. I'm really intrigued to see and hear what you think about today's episode, because it was such an interesting conversation. But of course, we do ask you a question of the week, and this week it is: who or what was your favorite Super Bowl halftime show? I'm going to tell you mine at the end, Mark, because someone else may have jumped in ahead of me, but I do have a favorite.
So you don't want to be the first? Is that how it works?
I don't want
to
be the first this time. Yes.
Bruce writes, the controversial JT and JJ Of course, referring
Oh,
to Justin
yes.
Timberlake and Janet Jackson, where there's a little bit of a wardrobe malfunction on Janet
That's
Jackson's part,
right. I remember that
making
now.
that
Yeah.
performance not very G-rated. I mean, it was a good performance. I mean, I think we all
No one
remember it
remembers
for the
it,
wrong
though.
reasons.
Yeah, no one remembers the songs.
No. Lonnie writes, it's hard to deny the performance that Lady Gaga put on in 2017. Did she not?
that was
I'm
it.
trying to remember if she did not. Didn't that performance start with her jumping off the roof into the stadium? I'm pretty
She
sure that
did.
was recorded ahead of time, but that was pretty cool. And there was a
That's the one.
drone
That was
show.
mine.
That was yours? Oh, okay, fine.
That was mine.
Is it
I
because
loved
there
that
was a
performance.
drone? There was a whole drone thing that happened on that one too, I think. But that was pretty cool.
I was fascinated by the fact that it took her. She did the whole thing. It was like 15 minutes straight, and I saw her on the news earlier that day, and she was taking so long to prepare for it. And you think all that for 15 minutes, but the amount of energy she had to put into that,
Oh,
honestly,
it's
it was
nuts.
incredible.
It's not, and the shape you have to be in, like people
Yeah.
underestimate that, but you have to be in such good shape to be able to sustain a performance like that. I know we say 15 minutes, but don't forget these people put on 3-hour shows. Here's another one from Steve. Steve writes, hands down 1993, Michael Jackson. He was the first pop icon to do a halftime show. Before 93, it was all marching bands. So yeah, that's what I kind of alluded to off the beginning of the show. It was really the first big pop icon to make a stand at a halftime show, which was pretty cool. Stephanie writes, Prince tied with the rap revival a couple of years back. Now, the rap revival, that was the one that I think I was going to go with. I loved Eminem, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg. It sounded good. It was, I don't remember how many times I watched it afterwards, but many times after that, I think I watched it with the family. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And Dave Brown writes, Bruno Mars 2014 and Katy Perry 2015. And a final one here from Karen, who writes, not a fair question. Too many great ones. Aerosmith 2001, Paul McCartney 2005, Stones 2006. Someone's been using their Google search. Tom Petty 2008, Prince 2007, Springsteen 2009, The Who 2010, Madonna 2012, Michael Jackson early 1990s, maybe 93. Okay, we get it, Karen. We get it. They're all equally as good, as will be Usher this weekend, I'm sure.
I think someone's been using ChatGPT. What we've learned today is that Dave Brown has no taste whatsoever. But I kind of knew that.
I knew that
he's just
beforehand,
proven
Stephen.
it.
Come on.
Yeah, he's just proven it.
Oh, well, you know what?
television.
Thank you for dealing with the show this week. And I think it was a good conversation to have. Thank you to Rochelle Minette for joining us. We're going to have her back on soon. Of course, on behalf of everybody on the show, do keep in touch with us at Access Tech Live. On behalf of Stephen Scott, I am Marc Aflalo. We will chat with you again next week. And coming soon, we're going to Vienna, Stephen. We'll talk about that soon.
Catch you next.
Thanks for tuning in to Access Tech Live. Follow us online on all social media at Access Tech Live. Email us feedback@accesstechlive.com. Hosted by Stephen Scott in Glasgow and Marc Aflalo in Montreal. Written by Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo. Producer, Marc Aflalo. Live show director, Anastasia Spalding-Stenhouse. Technical director, Caitlin Robinson. Audio, Jordan Mulgrave. Live graphics and playback, Kingsley Juco. Graphics coordinator, Eliza Rocco. Integrated described video specialist, M. Williams. Supervising producer, Michelle Dudas. Produced in collaboration with Aflalo Communications, Inc. and Double Tap Productions. Copyright 2024, Accessible Media, Inc.
An AMI original production.